Alrighty, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Happy Friday. We have a great presentation in store for you today, coming from one of our site manufacturer partners, Maglan Site Furniture. This topic today is based both on the fundamental reasons for actually selecting site furniture, as well as the subsequent placement of such furniture. And our guest presenter today is Clayton Mousley, a product designer of Maglan, and is here to educate or remind us that even at the individual component level, choices as a landscape architect or designer, they still really matter. So without saying too much more about the topic, I'm going to go through our standard Q&A reminders. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the Q&A window, which can be accessed by clicking the Q&A button on your screens. Some questions may be answered directly by me on the spot. Otherwise, we will see if there's a moment to answer the questions at a midpoint during the presentation. We will, of course, have time at the very end to get in questions over to Clayton to answer live. But from this point, I'd like to hand over to Clayton to introduce himself a little more and get us underway. Thanks, Clayton.
All right, thank you, Damien, and thank you for having me today. I just wanted to first, I'll cover over the outline here of what I'm going to cover today. So first, I'll go over my background and my role at Maglan Site Furniture, and then why placement matters, along with a few examples. And then I'll get into the details of product function and selection and product placement. I'll go in the order of bike racks, then tables and chairs, then benches, and then a few examples where we've had some opportunity to collaborate and put these guides into action. So my role at Maglan Site Furniture is industrial designer. So I'm very much focused on user-centered design. I'm thinking about the function, how the person's going to interact with the product. In this case, a bench, is it aesthetically appealing? Also looking at, manufacturing and mass production too as well. Now, when it comes to landscape architects, I know that there's so much more beyond the bench. You've got plants and pathways and water management, community goals, and so much more that just the bench actually just becomes a component of that bigger picture. So I'm hoping that this isn't what we get the result when you're installing a bench on site. So this is just a little fun image that we put in here. It's maybe a little bit exaggerative, but it just really goes to show that, from like an industrial designer's perspective, doesn't matter how functional or aesthetically appealing a bench is, if it's put on site in a manner where it can't be used or taken full advantage of, it kind of becomes useless. So even though it's a little over the top, it just really emphasizes how important it can be. And I'll show you a few more actual installs here. So you can see the bike rack on the left here, it's been installed too closely to the pathway. And then with this bike, it's cutting in, making it not very useful or unsafe. The other bike rack in the middle here, it's been installed in such a manner that only maybe one or two bike racks could be parked there instead of, say, 7. And then this bench on the right too, I mean, it's just been installed completely wrong, totally 180. And really you couldn't even use it as a bench at all. So it has become entirely useless in this case. And of course, these are extreme examples, but again, it kind of highlights the point of how it's placed and installed can really affect how useful something is on site. So I'll get into the first one in terms of product function and selection of bike racks. So a few things you'd want to consider are the max capacity of each bike rack that you're looking to achieve, the placement flexibility of that bike rack, the security level that it has built into it, and then also does it pair well with your site aesthetic. So looking at the image in the upper left corner here, ones that are good for 1 or 2 bikes are typically best for the most flexibility. They're installed individually. You can space them, you can turn them, you can curve them around your site a little bit better than if it's a large uniform structure. So that's always something to keep in mind depending on what you're doing on your site. Also, sturdy construction is something you're going to want to look at, especially if it's an area where theft or of that nature is a higher concern. If it's an area where there's people stealing bikes, you might want to consider something that's a little bit more sturdy versus some of the other options. One thing that I would recommend there is installing a bike rack that can be direct buried, that is poured in concrete rather than anchored. It just gives you another level of protection and resistance to actually even breaking that bike rack and then stealing the bike after, which does happen. And then this large image here too, if you have an area where you need a lot of capacity, you might consider larger bike racks such as this, where you can put your bikes a little bit more densely than when you compare to the other bike rack in the upper left corner there. It's not quite as densely placed, so you need a little bit more room for that. Whereas if you need a lot of bikes in a small area, you might consider something like this here in this image. So I'm going to look at actually the placements once you've selected your bike rack and you feel that it's one that best fits your needs on your site. One thing that you should always consider even before looking at these guidelines that I'm going to suggest here is you're going to want to look at your local codes. Match them first, because of course it's going to be important to ensure that you meet what they need, because you don't want to go back and change things and update them and have a whole change on site later. One thing to consider is, as mentioned, the sturdy bike racks is theft, but that also is related to location. So if you can consider a spot where there's good lighting, some good traffic, where there's some visibility, it's a really good thing to consider when you're deciding where to place them, maybe by some doors close by, rather than in areas where they're out back or hidden or maybe susceptible where people have some time to fiddle or meddle with the bike racks and then unfortunately steal them. Another thing too is looking at the quantity of bike racks. If there's any way that you can get a metric of how many people you could predict will park their bikes at any given location, it's really great to match the bike racks to that. I like this image here because it clearly shows that this location is under-equipped for bike racks, and this one here in the middle is so full that it's completely jammed, and people have resorted to tying to the rail there. So if you can avoid something like that, that's great. Even something that's too full too, like the one in the middle here, can cause quite a bit of damage to other people's bikes too, and it just generally might be a deterrent for people wanting to even bring their bike if it's already a situation like this. So it's a great thing if people want to park their bikes, but if there's enough bike racks to lock to, that's even better. So then look at the actual install locations and spacing of the bike racks. I looked at various guides and recommendations that they had. There's different dimensions all over the map in terms of what's suggested. I took all those numbers and kind of compiled them together and thought, well, I'll try those out myself at our shop here. And so I brought in a couple bikes and had some mock-ups done of a bike rack that we recently released. And what I did was just mocked up, imagining myself locking those bikes to those bike racks and imagine myself removing and taking them out just to get a feel for whether there was enough room to, one, maneuver and get to the bike rack, and then two, actually connecting and locking up. So that's what I did here. And with that, I developed a guide that we can share that has some common scenarios that you could run into when you're looking to actually place your bike rack. So in this case, this is the perpendicular to wall, curb, or object, and that's depicted in this little image here. I'll get into the details here on the next slide. So what I would suggest is keeping each rack itself 36 inches apart. You can apply this to any ring bike rack or two capacity bike rack, really. You could use this guide for a whole bunch of bike racks that might be available on the market. So that 36-inch gap you want in between that gives you good room for parking your bike in place, keeping it 30 inches away from the wall or curb. Allows just enough room for that tire so that it's not overhanging or banging into the wall or other object. And then if you're going to do two rows in parallel, I would recommend a 108-inch minimum there. That's accounting for a 36-inch gap so that people can walk in between those two rows and then get to their bike, and then also have enough room to pull their bike in and out of that location. So then another common way to place the bike racks would be just in perpendicular to the previous one. So this would actually be parallel to the wall. And you can see that depicted there. And so it's a little bit of a different measurement here. You can see again, still counting for 36-inch pathway, but you don't need to be quite as far apart because you can pull your bike in line with that bike rack, so you can tuck them in a little bit tighter. And then I'd recommend a little bit more room near that curb or wall, especially if you want to account for people walking in beside their bike there. In the other instance, that would just be accounting for the wheel where people wouldn't actually have to access. So here you need a little bit more room. And then from one bike rack to the next, from edge to edge, it leaves 78 inches. This gives enough room for the full-sized adult bike and then enough room to pull out again. And so here's another little tip, and this can really depend on what you're doing on your site. You can see that if the bike racks are in parallel with each other in this top image, and they're spaced the recommended 36 inches, an adult bike would take approximately 65.5 inches, might depend on the specific model, but that's a rough estimate there. And then if you had 5 bike racks in a row, spaced at 36, that equals 154 inches. But if you're looking at a walkway where you've got limited space, you might consider turning those bike racks on a 45. So you can see in this case that bike that was 65.5 inches actually would only take up a depth of 47 inches. Now the thing here though to consider of course is that you're now spreading it over a greater distance or linear line there. So that could really depend on whatever is working best for your site. Simply turning it kind of as a little tip there for freeing up some space in some other areas, whether it be a walkway or pathway. So now I'm going to talk about some product function selections of tables and chairs. So a few features and things that you'd want to think about. Again, maximum capacity per table, the desired use, umbrellas, a movable versus a fixed option, and accessibility. So when thinking about the desired use, you might want to imagine or decide what type of activity is going to happen there. Is it just simply an area where there's going to be cocktails and coffee, or is it an area where there's supposed to be work done where people will be taking out their laptops and papers and other things, or are they sitting down for a full meal? Another thing too is you'd want to ask up front, are umbrellas going to be at this site? Some tables we'll have the option where you can go back later and add that addition if you can't decide up front, but you'll want to be conscious of that and decide whether you think that that will be something that will be required on site. And then in terms of movability, you'll want to consider whether you want an anchored table or one that can be moved. Chairs that can stack are great for packing away to at night. There's certain courtyards and spaces that want to clean up every night or weekly. So once that stack could make that a lot easier and simpler for maintenance crews to take care of. So that's something you might want to consider too as well. So going back to the table size and capacity, mentioning the cocktails and having coffees, something like a two-person 30-inch table with 2 chairs might be appropriate for that type of setting. Whereas if you're thinking that maybe it's a sit-down meal, you might want to look at the 36 inches where you can actually have 4 people and 4 chairs. Another thing too to keep in mind, here we're showing a 30-inch diameter and a 30-inch width. The square tables will afford you a little bit more room in terms of square footage if you're looking at the exact same dimension. If you need more room and you prefer the circular shape, I would then select maybe the next size up to account for a little bit additional room. So I want to talk about ADA standards for accessible design. They have specific requirements, and it is law in the US that they have to meet. And those are in scenarios where dining surfaces are provided for the consumption of food and drink. So you need at least 5% of the seats there, tables matching these dimensions. So if you want to just take a look, we've got this image here. It helps summarize a lot of the notes. They have those written out in the full-blown document that you can reference on the link on this slide here. But you want to ensure that there's 27-inch clearance underneath. The table height is between 28 and 34 inches. And then all these other dimensions are accounting for the toe and knee clearance. And those references you can see there are the sections that you could pull up if you'd like to look at those yourself. And we get asked about this so often that we actually have a guide that just helps make a little visual and kind of summarizes it a little bit better than having to reference multiple sections within the accessibility, the ADA guide. And then we also paired that out with our models that we know match. So that's something you'd want to keep in mind, regardless of fabricator. I mean, not every bench or series or style of table will likely have a bench, or sorry, rather a table that would work for these dimensions. So you want to keep that in mind. And some do a better job or might have a bit of a different aesthetic that you're after. So you want to just verify and cross-reference something like this to ensure that it fulfills the dimensions. So ADA is one guide. GATES is another organization. It's the Global Alliance for Accessible Technologies and Environments. They're very similar in terms of what they suggest in terms of toe and knee clearance and table height. The one big difference that they have is they actually recommend 20% of the tables for each public outdoor space be accessible. So by all means, I mean, if you're just looking to fulfill the ADA, that might be adequate from the legal side, but you certainly can consider going above and beyond and going by some of these other guidelines and having some extra tables. And in often case, these tables are they're just as good for everyone and anyone to use anyways. So why not maybe bump it up and add a few more? So I'm going to look at the placement of the tables and chairs. And here you just kind of see example of a typical space where we'd have those spread out. But the question might be, well, how am I going to space those out, or what's too dense? So oftentimes, if we're thinking about restaurants, they definitely try and cram in as much as they can. And it's not really great to get in and out of your seat or get to your table. This here is what I would suggest as a bare minimum. This is not really considering an open aisle space, but enough room that if people are pulling in their seats, they both have enough room from back to back. You can see where that 18 inches is noted. You can pull out your chair and still get out, and then you would need to tuck your chair in if you want to get through, because if you left it out, of course, it would still be very difficult to get to this. So this is a minimum, and I'd say the most dense you would want to make your tables and chairs. If you want to go and you have the opportunity to have a little bit more room, I would suggest spreading your tables out at 72 inches minimum from edge to edge. And then that also accounts for leaving a 36-inch minimum access route. That's also great too. If you're thinking about the ADA tables, you're leaving a pathway too for people to get in and out. And again, this is a minimum. If you want to think about, the 18-inch dimension there is only accounting for if someone's actually sitting at it. I would leave another 12 to 18 inches on top of that 72 if you want to have it so that that 36-inch access way is maintained while their chairs are out. So that would be even better. So if the space provides that amount of room for you to spread it out a little bit further, by all means, I would do that. Of course, this is all more critical when you're putting in a fixed installation. If it's movable, of course, you can just slide it and adjust it as you go. But if you're anchoring or doing a direct burial installation, you'll want to decide that beforehand because it will become permanent, of course. And then this, kind of like the bike racks, just turning them, you get a little bit of a different relationship between the tables. And this would be more important, of course, again, when it's permanent. You can actually tuck your tables in a little bit closer, but it'll still maintain that 36, just because in this case, the square ones, then the chairs would typically be in line with the one side there, so they can tuck in a little bit more, and then you can then bring your tables in a little bit closer. Oh, and then I would also mention too that if there's a wall or other structure in the way, I would leave about 4 feet on the side there. You can see that noted. So also you'll want to consider the other dimensions showed the actual proportions and dimensions of the table itself, but you want to look at the area that's clear in front of the table. That same guide that I was mentioning earlier, that's pointed out here. So you won't want to put anything in the way there. That's the area that the wheelchair can then access. ADA also outlines what is required, and this is again the minimum of a 30-inch width where they would approach the table, and then a 48-inch depth. You'd have to keep that clear. And that's section 305 if you want to look that up in the ADA guide. And then as GATES was mentioned earlier, they have a little bit different, in this case, they actually suggest a minimum of a 2000 millimeter clearance all around the table. That works out to about 6.5 feet. That can be really good just for allowing to actually get to the side where the accessibility may be if there's only one side that it can be accessed. They also suggest having a firm, stable, level ground, which makes sense because getting to that location will require them to wheel up their chair. So anything that can be done there to improve the accessibility to that table is a great thing to do. And here we have an example of that, right? So you can see the nice level firm. They've got it even poured concrete. You can get all around the table, and that one end there, it's got the nice depth, knee and toe clearance, and the overhang there where they can access it. So there's a nice example of that in application. So now I'm going to talk about the product function and selection of benches. So when you're looking at benches, you'll definitely want to consider the functions that it offers, its accessibility again, like the tables, and the seating capacity. So looking at seating functions, most benches typically get lumped kind of in one of these groups or have these options. You know, you'll have your backless benches, ones with arms, and backed benches. So the backless benches are great for areas where there's no direction. They're non-directional. So if you're in the middle of a pathway, they can be accessed from both sides. They're also very cost effective typically because they don't have extra material to have the supporting back. And if they're armless too as well, there's typically a little bit less materials. So if you're looking to get a lot of seats for the least amount of money, that might be something you want to mix in to your site. Adding arms to those benches helps people get up and down out of those seats. So it's great to have a few, especially those with mobility issues or the elderly. It can certainly help just to have that arm there getting up and down and into the actual seat. And then if you want to add a little bit more relaxation and rest to the seat, where people could sit for maybe a little bit longer, you could then add some backs to those. And then you could also conjunction that with arms too as well, so it helps them get in and out of those seats. So I just want to touch on this. This one comes up every now and then, every few months. We get someone well-intentioned to match a bench to ADA, not Section 903. This, I just want to point out, this does not apply to outdoor benches. It's only applicable to sauna, steam rooms, dressing, fitting, and locker rooms holding cells. I have actually contacted the ADA about this, and they have clarified that no, it indeed does not apply to outdoor benches. So it's not written into law. Now, there is also, I haven't mentioned yet, the United States Access Board. So this is some suggestions, sorry, to add to your site in terms of the benches. Um, these guidelines aren't required by law, but they are recommendations. So what they suggest is a 17 and 19-inch seat height. That is very common. You'll find that most benches match that height. And then they also suggest having benches with armrests, and they suggest that's most useful. And then as well as having a back support. So you can go to that link there, and there's the sections that are referenced. And we also have that paired with our ADA guide. So you can see those dimensions marked out there, and you can then also compare to benches. We have a list of benches of ours that are compatible with that. You, of course, could use that guide to reference any other brand or company too as well, and see if it fulfills those guidelines. When talking about seating capacity, so what I've typically done in the past is left 24 inches as a space for one person. So that's enough for the person and a little bit of elbow and breathing room. And I would count that as enough seating room for one person. And of course, you know, you do that twice, you got enough for 2 and 3 and so forth, if you want to count seating capacity. Now, I just want to talk about kind of an application, what that actually looks like. So that's great for if you're talking about family and friends, you know, and they're going to fully fill the seating capacity. They'll sit, you know, one by one right beside each other, and you could say that, you know, you count one seat per person. But if it's a public space or there's a space where there's suspected to be more strangers engaging the seating, you might want to consider it more at 33 to 50% capacity, because typically we see, you know, people, if there's a stranger on one 6-foot bench, they'll typically avoid that if there's another seat around and go to another bench. So if you're trying to get kind of a metric on how many benches you need to spec for your site, you might want to just think about what type of people will be sitting at it. So now I'll talk about the placements of the actual benches. So one of the big features of a bench really is that it's a place to sit, it's a place to rest. So when you're thinking about that, it's really great to consider, well, what's the view? We know we had that funny view or funny picture there with the view up front there. Always considering where they're going to be looking out to is a nice thing to consider. It makes the sitting experience all that much enjoyable, and maybe they'll sit and rest a little bit longer. So that's just a little detail to think about when you're even just orienting, because if you turn this around, you could see even in this image, they'd be potentially looking at a wall too as well. Also, you want to consider that you might want to spread them out evenly too. If it's along a pathway too, providing a reasonable increment of rest is great too as well, so that people who can't walk as far have that extra little break in between distances. And as mentioned, I was talking about the rest in the view. If the site requires it, or it's an area that's sunny, or you need a little bit of a break from the sun, it's great to consider shade. That could be either from vegetation or structure, um, and you might want to consider where that bench actually gets placed too, because it can make that seating experience all that much more enjoyable depending on where it may be placed. So I want to talk about gates and the placement of benches and what they suggest. They have a couple little different pointers. So same as USAB, they recommend having armrests and backrests, but they also suggest having a clear area to provide clear ground floor area next to the rest to accommodate people who may require mobility aids, service animals, or strollers. So this is a few more things even beyond just the wheelchair. And so they have this image here, and the link there is down below, where they suggest having a little bit of a pad beside the bench so that someone in a wheelchair could wheel beside, or if you think about someone with a stroller or a mobility aid, they might want to just pull those up beside and be able to sit on the actual bench. So it's really a multi-use, multifunctional space there that's really great to add. They also suggest having the arm removed on that side too, in case maybe you're mobile enough that you want to slide and sit on that bench. And then if you put the arm on the opposite side, you're also fulfilling the need for people who could need that to get up and down. So it's a versatile way of setting up a seating section. And as mentioned, the USAB, they also suggest having a clear space beside, just like gates there too as well. They have a 48 to 36 inch recommendation. Again, this wouldn't be law, but this is things that they're suggesting people put in. At some point, it could be a requirement, but as of now, it's a guideline, and I think it's a good guideline to reference. So when thinking about configuring furniture, it can really depend on sort of what social setting you're trying to create. So depending on where you put your seats and how you spread them out and how you orient them, you can really create individual spaces where people can have their own private messaging sessions or phone calls, or if you have a little bit of a privacy in between, it just gives them a little bit of seclusion rather than if they're out in the open. And so here's an example of that. You got these sort of individual space where people can kind of take over one and make it their own for a moment. Also, if you're thinking about collaboration, orienting seats towards each other is really a great way to intentionally facilitate that, where they can face each other and have a discussion. And it's just a simple way of really facilitating that too as well, and just all by turning the seating in a certain orientation. And of course, we see that when you're placing tables and chairs, people typically will kind of do a C shape or look towards each other so that when they're having a conversation, of course, they can look at each other. So if that's something that you want to sort of implement, you might want to just think about where you're placing those benches so that it really affords that opportunity for people. And then kind of the last type of social interaction that we could maybe talk about is areas where people can congregate. So you got strangers, but they're still out together and sharing time out in the open, but they're still kind of in their own world maybe, but still enjoying the open public space, with the people, but still by yourself. You can kind of see that in this practice here, right? So you got people, they're sort of turned away from each other, but they're still enjoying the fact that they're out in the open public. So you might want to consider how you're placing seating like this if you want to kind of encourage something like this or provide a nice open square where the public can kind of mingle together. Also, it wasn't mentioned yet, but a lot of what was shown, it would be typical off-the-shelf things. We see many different custom projects come through where they're actually adapting the product to their site, or it's very integrated. And by all means, certainly talk to your manufacturer about that and contact them and let them know what you're doing. Certainly there's many opportunities out there to really tailor specific benches to your site if that's something that you're after. So I'm going to talk about just the details for a second here before showing some examples. Here's a quote I love by Charles Eames: "The details are not the details, they make the design." And so I'll show that in this case here. So this is a really nice site from this top view. It matches the planters quite nicely. But when we got into the details here, we see that when it came to the site leveling and shimming, it looks as though that may have grabbed kind of whatever fasteners they had maybe lying around. We've got two different types here. There's a fairly significant gap underneath those legs. And so all this can come down sometimes just to maybe relaying information to a contractor, or maybe even going back to your site furnishing provider, and just maybe working for a solution that maybe is a little bit more adaptive to the site. I suspect in this case that the ground was quite varied, so they tried to maybe compensate on site. So it's always nice if you can have a little bit a nicer fit and finish on those details. It really just helps polish off the whole project and makes it all come together. And another instance too is where it's really looking at the details of the actual installation and looking at installation instructions. So in this case, this bench is missing a component, and you see these exposed fasteners, and doesn't quite look as great as it could. In that case, there was an instruction available, and sometimes that's just really making sure it gets into hands that need it. So whether it be the contractor or other installer, getting those into their hands is important. And maybe sometimes too, it requires a follow up to site, and just making sure that all those components can get put in place, especially if you have a large bench or something that's going to be installed or rather assembled on site. That can be more of an issue versus something that's already pre-assembled, for example.
Hi, Clayton. I've just got a question actually in relation to the ADA considerations that you've sort of brought to attention in the previous few slides. So, in your experience, and I suppose opinion as well, based on those recommendations, would you recommend selecting a product that has been specifically designed to accommodate, um, people's with disabilities, or mobility issues, I should say, or just generally allowing for more space around products or items that have been, spaced around the site? Do you have a recommendation on that?
I think some products do certainly a better job than others. I don't know that you need one necessarily specific to it. I think if they fulfill the requirement, they could certainly still be beneficial as long as you have that knee and toe clearance, and then you got the width. Um, and in terms of spacing, though, I would definitely recommend always having that space, because I think that's absolutely critical, right? When you want to get in and out, if the site affords that opportunity. So,
Yeah, for sure. No worries. Keep on going. Thank you.
thanks. So I just saw a few collaborative examples here. Um, Oftentimes we have customers who have various site requirements, and we kind of can categorize them sort of into these three groupings. So there's the open-ended, where someone might have just a certain set size of space, and they don't really have any specific goal or intention that they know of just yet, and they want us to put some site furnishings in that. The other is they might have an idea of kind of what functionally they want to get out of it. So maybe like an eating and working space, but they haven't picked the product, so they're just the function that they know. And then we have others that they're very specific, and they just need us to help out with the final details in terms of getting spec drawings and making sure that it fulfills their budget. So here's an example of one that was open-ended. So it took a little bit of back and forth. These can be sometimes the trickiest, because we'll just have to go back to them and say, well, what kind of function or what's happening in and around, because we don't always see necessarily what's beyond just the area where the furniture is to be installed. So with a little bit of dialogue, we can usually suggest something that would fit in their space. So in this case, they had some food establishments by, so that's where the seating and the chairs came in play. And then there was also some kids shops, and they wanted an area for kids. So that's where on the right hand side, we suggested some areas where kids could climb up and have some seats where they could have a little bit of fun with. And so there's a couple of renderings of that. So you can see the food and then a little bit of a rest area with the loungers there on the left. And then on the right, the yellow platform there is an area where the kids can climb up. And then this was one you might not have seen in the other image there. This was to have a space where parents and kids could sit together. So you got a little bit of the lower seat there. and then the higher seats that the adults could sit on. So it's a little bit more appropriate for their size. And then just an image of where you can see a couple different uh, functional areas that were worked out. So you can see you've got an eating area on the right here, and then down below you've got some lounges that you can rest in. So in the case of working with functional spaces, this architect came back and they wanted uh, different spaces for lounging, a lunch area, and a social area. But they didn't really have a narrowed down to what type of furniture, specifically what kind they wanted in those spaces, and we're looking for some suggestions. It is a bit of a unique shape because it is sort of this wedge shape, so trying to keep an access way in there was a little bit tricky. But what we ended up coming back and suggesting was these two-person tables and then a few benches in place there too. And then you can see maintaining that center section clear. Also in the second lounge, we did a very similar layout too as well. A little bit of an open section and then the tables and chairs on the outside. And then for the lunch area, we proposed some 1050 tables and chairs there. So those are just some areas where you can um, enjoy your lunch, a little bit more room, and then you got the tables to the right or that are a little bit lower. So just giving you a little bit more variety. And then you have the spot on the far right there where you can rest and hang out after your lunch. So kind of a little bit of a different dynamic and depending on what you kind of want to do when you're on your lunch. And then for the social area, we had some C-shaped bench sections suggested. So kind of going back to earlier when you're trying to facilitate those areas that are good for, say, discussion. You know, in this little kind of nook here, you have a group of people and they can face each other and have some conversation and just relax. And there's just an example, if you can see those tables and benches, which are providing a lunch space for people. And so in this instance, the landscape architect had a very specific goal in mind, and they pretty well laid everything out and knew what they wanted, but we helped come along and worked with the presentation and helped them fulfill um, some images and presentation materials for them, and then worked with their pricing too as well. And so they had this relaxation space, and going back again earlier, you know, you have these different zones where you kind of have little private sections where people could just enjoy their own time and sit and rest and have their little corner to enjoy. And then the lunch space, same tables that have come up a couple times now. They wanted those on their site there where they could have an area that they could pull out their lunch, and it gives ample room to pull things out and enjoy and sit and have a lunch. And then they wanted a fun and social space as well, some area where it'd be kind of interesting to climb up on and different positions and spots you could sit on, and just be a little bit more dynamic. And in this case, you know, it's another example of where the landscape architect had a specific bench and size that they needed on site, and we tailored the spec drawings to their radius and size that they required. And then we pass those drawings on to them, and then they sign off on that. So we're just kind of helping with the last sort of step there, and it's very much already kind of selected what they want. So just here's a summary of the resources that were mentioned. So the ADA, if you want to link back to that, you can go to that site there. The USAB, they have a bunch of additional guidelines, specifically, as mentioned, the bench there. So you can go and check that out. And to the GAATES, and as well as the Maglin link there too. So that's the guideline that I pulled up a couple times there too. And that's sort of like a nice, quick, fast track summary of those key bits of information that you might want when it comes to tables and benches. So hopefully going through everything I have today, we can maybe inspire you to have different views and avoid situations like this, and hopefully have more things like this that are really great. And I thank you all for listening today.
Thanks, Clayton. Just got a couple of questions. When it comes to designing new pieces, as you're the industrial designer, are you ever really responding to particular criteria set out sort of by the industry, or is it kind of a premeditated goal of site furniture manufacturers to actually have a catalog of items that fit, you know, as many of those contexts that you mentioned as possible?
Yeah, I would say it could be a little bit of both. We're always listening to what people are doing on their sites. A lot of products that we've developed have really been in response to what we're seeing and people are looking for. I would say even kind of our direction towards modularity has really been trying to adapt to people wanting to do things a little bit different. So we have kind of more of a toolkit that affords them a lot of different options. But then there's other instances where there's a specific product where we just don't have an option, and we kind of set forth to kind of fill that void that's in our lineup. So hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, for sure. And sort of on the similar track, when requirements coming from a, say, a client, a project, or a site fall outside of your sort of pre-existing model, in really any manufacturer's suite of products, how do you typically meet those challenges or expectations? How do you respond to those sorts of things on the spot?
Yeah, so we have a whole separate kind of division, I'd say, or a group of people who look into custom or modified products. So we would probably funnel those questions through to them, and any details we can get, we're willing to entertain. So whether it's a unique product that they're looking for, if they've got some working drawings or suggestions, we have a team that can review that, whether it's something that we have experience with or we'd be able to provide something for. And even if it's on just like a details level, we're certainly happy to help them achieve something if it's even just a small component to an existing product. So let's say if it was the shimming issue, or they've got even more severe gradation on the site and they need some type of special leg, but the rest of the product needs to remain the same. We're happy to look at anything that helps fulfill the site. So we're definitely always open to looking at and uh, meeting those different requirements that maybe don't kind of fit the typical mold of our lineup. So
Fantastic. Well, we haven't had too many questions today, which I honestly always say speaks to the quality and clarity of the presentation at hand. So I really want to say uh, thank you to Clayton for that. If anyone does end up having further questions, especially about the resources or even some of the challenges that Clayton's brought up during the presentation, his contact info is there, and we certainly encourage further contact with our guest presenters to discuss things further on. So you can certainly do that. We are, of course, posting this webinar on our website later this afternoon. So if you need to rewatch and pick up on a couple of details, pass it on to anyone else who wasn't able to make it to today's live session, you can do that. But big thanks to everyone who attended this morning and participated. These don't happen without your continued and enthusiastic engagement, so thank you. And in finishing up, I want to thank Clayton and the Magdalene team for their time, not only presenting today, but putting this presentation together for us, and hopefully we'll continue to put efforts towards getting more guest presenters like this lined up for the future. So thank you again, and have a fantastic weekend, everyone.
great.
Cheers.
Thank you.